Okay, guys, so I wanted to talk a little bit about statutes before we start going through them in class. Some of you may be a little bit more familiar with statutory research than others, but I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page, and clearly we can talk about any of this that doesn't seem clear when we meet next week. So I'm going to go through this PowerPoint and then do a quick demo of a few things online just to hopefully make what I'm saying make more sense. But just to start out, really important in so many areas of the law, but particularly in criminal law, to keep in mind that you could have, and will often have, an interplay of state and federal primary law, and that can be constitutional provisions, statutes, cases, you name it. But definitely keep that in mind, as there might be relevant statutes on both the state and federal level. Always keep in mind that statutes have to be in line with constitutional provisions, again, on both the federal and state level. And as I've mentioned in class a few times, keep in mind that the Massachusetts Constitution and the New York Constitution, both jurisdictions that many of you are interested in practicing in, are often more protective than our federal Constitution. Okay. Also, clearly, statutes are often interpreted by the judiciary, right? They don't necessarily mean what they look like they mean. They mean what the judiciary says they mean. So you need to be aware of instances in which the federal and state judiciaries have interpreted particular statutory provisions. All right. The big area in criminal law where it's really important to look at statutes. In fact, it's hard to think of an area where it isn't important to look at statutes. But I guess sort of the big one that probably comes up the most is actually the one I have listed second, definitions of crimes, right? At one point in our history, there were a lot of common law crimes. At this point, most crimes have been codified, have been passed by the legislature and are in our statutory codes. There are some examples of common law crimes, which I'll touch on sort of briefly in class. One classic example in Massachusetts is conspiracy, which is still a common law crime. It's not defined by statute. So crimes themselves are laid out in statutes. Jurisdiction is laid out in statutes, right? Which court can hear certain types of crimes. Already sort of introduced you to this a little bit with the MCLE treatise and having you look up which courts in Mass have jurisdiction over criminal cases, right? Superior Court always, district court sometimes. Another important thing to keep in mind with criminal cases is whether the statute of limitations has passed for prosecuting someone, and that is a piece of information that you will find in statutes. Some procedural requirements. We'll also talk later in the course about court rules. And then sentences are often laid out in statutes as well. Okay, so a lot of biggies there. And the one thing I really wanted to focus on in this video is to talk about how statutes are published, okay? Because they're published in sort of a funky way, and this tends to confuse a lot of people. And when I was a reference librarian at the AG's office, which is where I worked before I came here, I often found that there were a lot of practicing attorneys, usually not older attorneys because they'd had to figure this out at some point, but younger attorneys who were really confused about how statutes are published. And I think that having a decent grasp on this before you go into practice can save you a lot of time. So there are two basic things to keep in mind, right? One is that every law passed by a legislature, whether it's a state legislature or the Congress on the federal level, every law is published in what's called a session law format, okay? And that means they're just published chronologically, okay? There's no subject matter arrangement. They're just sort of bound in a book, starting with the first law passed in a particular session of the legislature all the way through the last law. Okay. On the federal level, you'll hear these referred to as session laws. You'll often hear them referred to or cited as public laws. It's that PL citation that you'll sometimes run into. People sometimes say acts. Okay. On the state law, again, session laws, acts. Sometimes they're referred to or cited as chapters. Okay. One way you can tell when you're looking at a session law citation is that there'll usually be some indication of a year or the number of a Congress. Okay, so just big thing to keep in mind here is session laws are chronological. Okay, the big thing that you guys are probably more familiar with are statutory codes. Okay, this is the United States Code. On the Massachusetts side would be the general laws of Massachusetts. These are subject arrangements, okay, of acts or of statutes. And the reason you've heard of these is because this is what people use, because it's a lot more useful to have something arranged by subject where you have all the laws on crimes and punishments, all the laws on tax, public health, what have you, arranged by subject, instead of having to flip back and forth between years. Okay, you can imagine how that would be really, really difficult to research. Okay, but it is important to know the difference, because I'll mention later there are specific times when it's really helpful to go and look at a session law. Okay, but the big divide: session laws are chronological, codes are subject based. Okay. All right, so a little bit about session laws, because this is how statutes are published first. Okay, the image that you see now is of the United States statutes at large. That's the federal session law compilation, and you'll see that volume on the left is from 1789. So that would include the very first act of Congress. Okay, the next volume, actually, you'll see that first volume just to sort of demonstrate how many laws we now pass compared to what we did at the beginning. Notice that that first volume includes 1789 through March 3rd, 1845. And then compare it to this next image of the statutes at large from 2009. Okay, there's 3 volumes there just for 2009. So if you go up and look at the statutes at large, again, it's purely chronological, starting with 1789 all the way through. I think at this point we may be up to 2010 volumes. It's quite a bit behind. But you can find the recent ones usually freely available online. Okay, but this is the official publication, the United States Statutes at Large. Okay, purely chronological. On the state level, every state has a session law compilation. Okay, in Massachusetts, it's called the Acts and Resolves of Massachusetts. The early ones titled the Province of Massachusetts Bay. So you can see, I took a picture of some early volumes. The first one begins in 1692. Volume 2 covers 1715 through 1741. And then more recent ones, 2008, 2009, 2010. Right? So if you think about it, think about trying to find, using a chronological set, all the laws on the subject of battery, right? You'd basically have to go through year by year and look in the subject index at the back, piece it all together, figure out which provisions had been repealed, which ones were still in effect but had maybe been amended. I assure you it would be an absolute nightmare, and that's how these topical codes that we now use predominantly came into existence. Okay, but this is the Massachusetts Session Law compilation, the Acts and Resolves of Massachusetts. Okay, and then since the bound volumes are behind, commercial publishers like Lexis and Westlaw publish their own session law compilations that are a little bit more up to date. See, this is a picture I took for my ALR class last semester, and you can see there were little pamphlets for session laws passed in May, June, and July of 2012. Okay. Right. This is just a screenshot from the Mass Legislature's website where you can see the session laws for 2012. Again, Chapter 1 would be the first law passed by the Mass Legislature, on down the list. Okay. There are usually hundreds in a given year, and again, just arranged chronologically. Okay. When you're doing statutory research in a state, it's always good to know what the different statutory compilations are, and the Blue Book is a huge help on this. You go to Table 1, all the jurisdictions are listed alphabetically, and you can see here for California, statutory compilation. This is the code. These are the different codes. So West publishes one, Lexis publishes one, and you can see that California has what's called a nominative code, where it's not arranged in like chapter order. This will make more sense when we look at the print versions. So you need to be really careful when you cite, say, the California Code or the New York Code, which is similar, and let them know sort of what part of the code you're looking at. So California, and then that's what the subject indicator is with the carets, is you have to put in which area of the code you were in. But don't get too hung up on that. I think that makes more sense when you actually are in the process of researching. And we'll look at that in more detail later. In addition to the code compilations, you'll also see the session law compilation. So the official California session law compilation, so their chronological one, is called the Statutes of California. That's their equivalent to our Acts and Resolves of Massachusetts, or the federal United States statutes at large. All right, so the session laws, again, that's the chronological compilation. Statutory codes, subject-based compilation. Okay, one thing that tends to confuse people is that they think that codes include all of the laws passed by a legislature. It's not true. The United States Code does not include all laws passed by the federal Congress. The Massachusetts General Laws doesn't include every law passed by the Massachusetts legislature. Instead, codes include laws of a general and permanent nature. So basically, they include laws that are meant to be sort of aimed at everybody, and that they're passed with the intention of staying in effect for, certainly not indefinitely, but for a while, right? And then the idea of codes is that they're updated so that they only include laws that are currently in effect. So if you go and pull an edition of the United States Code, it's not going to include some provision that was passed in 1832 and has subsequently been repealed. It's just the provisions that are currently in effect. Okay. Though sometimes you can go find a historical edition of a code and figure out what the law looked like in the past. Okay. Beware that depending on jurisdictions, a statutory code could go by a variety of names. Some jurisdictions called them annotated codes, some say compiled statutes, some have revised statutes. Here in Massachusetts, ours are called the General Laws of Massachusetts. So it's not always particularly clear what the name will be for a jurisdiction, and that's where the Blue Book again can help you out. Okay, so the U.S. Code, you have 3 different publications, right? The official one is the United States Code, which a lot of you are probably pretty familiar with. This comes out every 6 years in a new edition and is updated annually with these sort of hardbound supplements, and it tends to be very behind in publication. That's why these 2 on the right tend to be the ones that are most used by practitioners. Those are the unofficial ones published by West. That's the United States Code Annotated, or the USCA, and then the USCS, which is Lexis's equivalent. In addition to being more up-to-date, practitioners also like these because they include annotations. Okay, those are references to secondary sources, a lot of which we've been talking about in class, and notes of decision, right, which lay out the case law that has discussed a particular statutory provision. So those are incredibly useful research tools. So the vast majority of the time what you'll be using are an unofficial annotated version, regardless of whether it's the USCA and the USCS on the federal level or the state equivalents. In Massachusetts, we have a similar structure where there are 3 publications of our statutory code. The official one is called the General Laws of Massachusetts. Okay, has no annotations, literally just the text of the statute, but it is the official one. So if there was any discrepancy between the text of the language and these official General Laws of Massachusetts and the language in these unofficial annotated codes, the official one would control. Okay, but in terms of unofficial, you have the MGLA published by West. That's the one that's going to be available on Westlaw. Okay, and then the ALM, the Annotated Laws of Massachusetts, which is Lexis's publication, and that's what you'll get on Lexis.com or Lexis Advance. Okay. So how do you find a statute and a statutory code? A lot of you have probably done this in print. And online, you could use an index or a table of contents. There's also something called a popular name table. So if you have an act that's commonly referred to by what's called a popular name, think of something like the Patriot Act. You could go to this popular name table and it would convert the popular name, like the Patriot Act, to a statutory code citation. So it would tell you what title of the United States Code and section to go look at. Okay, and then when we're talking about the world of electronic statutory research, clearly you also have available full text searching, right? So this is where we've talked about on the Westlaw Classic and Lexis.com, you could either choose to do a natural language or terms and connector search, and then those are sort of blended together a little bit on the new platforms, Westlaw Next and Lexis Advance. Okay, so sometimes when I talk about the difference between session laws and codes, people ask, well, why do I need to know about session laws? It seems like the code is the most useful thing because it's arranged by subject. You get the annotations. And that's a great question, and the majority of the time you are going to be using the code. But there are a few instances in which you need to know how to find session laws and what they are. And one is you might need to look at an act as it was originally passed. I mentioned that codes, right, they're constantly updated. They incorporate changes. So you're looking at what's currently in effect. Sometimes if you're doing historical research, you need to know what the act looked like at a given point in the past. One important thing to keep in mind when you're a criminal practitioner is that you're dealing often with behavior that has already happened, right? So somebody's been charged with battery or armed robbery for an action that they committed maybe a few months ago, maybe even a year ago, or multiple years ago if they've just been caught and charged. So you may need to find the text of an act as it was when the behavior occurred, and that might not necessarily be the same as it exists now in a code. It might have been amended since that behavior happened. So that sort of covers the first 2 points there. Sometimes you might want to find it as originally passed because you're doing historical research, or maybe it originally passed because that's what was in effect at the time the behavior occurred. Okay, so those first 2 are sort of related. And then the flip side of that is that session laws, because they're acts of Congress or of a state legislature, they're constantly being passed, right? Congress is perpetually passing laws. The mass legislature is continually passing laws. So the idea is that codes, which are updated very quickly actually on West and Lexis, but nonetheless, they're constantly changing, right? And there's always a chance that something new has passed that affects the provision that you're looking at. And that's where session laws can come in again. So they're important sort of sometimes when you're doing historical research or you're looking backwards to see what the law was. They're also important in terms of making sure you're updated. Okay? Because codes represent what has happened in the law, right? What's currently in effect. And if something new just happened, perhaps it hasn't been incorporated into a code. Okay, again, Lexis and Westlaw are very up to date, so it's not as much of a concern there, and we'll talk about how you can update those even further. But sometimes if you don't have access to Lexis or West, you might be looking at a state legislature's website at the version of the code there. Often those aren't as up to date, so you would need to go to look at the session laws and make sure nothing has happened. And again, just sort of start to try to get a sense of these concepts, and we'll talk more about it in class. And when you're faced with more concrete examples, I think this will make more sense. Okay, one other thing we'll talk about a lot is updating, which is related to what I was just saying. You always need to know, if you're working with a statutory code, how up to date it is, okay, in terms of date. It also, relatedly, you need to know how many session laws, right, that the legislature has passed have actually been incorporated into the code you're working with. Is there legislation out there that the particular version of the code you're working with hasn't incorporated yet? Okay. You need to be able to find session laws that have passed that haven't been incorporated that might potentially affect your provision. You need to be aware on Lexis and West, this is a great thing. They have flags that indicate there's proposed legislation, that would be a yellow flag, or enacted legislation, that would be a red flag. But again, if you're working with free resources, you won't have that sort of indicator. So it's that much more important to understand how to go look for session laws. Okay, and then there are some sites that we'll talk about later that you can go to figure out if new legislation has affected a code provision that you're working with. Okay. So with that, what I want to do really quickly is just show you guys a couple of things. One is, let me click here. This is the Massachusetts Legislature's website, and I'll actually back up a screen. This is their homepage. You'll see you can get the text of the Constitution. Again, all of this will be unannotated, right? So it's just the text, no notes of decision, no references to secondary sources. The general laws of Mass, this is our code, right? So arranged by subject. Part 4 is crimes and punishments and criminal proceedings. So this is a lot of the statutes we'll be working with in class, right? Again, arranged by subject. And if we actually click in and look at something, enticing away a person under 16 for marriage. You just get the text of the statute, right? No notes, no history about when this came into effect, but at the same time, this is free. One thing, I've already referred to, but that I'll harp on you guys constantly about is when you're looking at sources, but particularly free sources, you want to see how up to date they are, right? So this is up to date through all amendments to the general laws passed through June 30th. So this is what I was referring to earlier, is potentially since June 30th there have been laws enacted that would affect these provisions, right? And that's when you want to go look at the session laws. Okay, so these are all the acts that were passed by the legislature in 2012. We saw that code took into effect all the ones that were passed through June 30th. Okay, so all the changes made from Chapter 1 to 134 have been incorporated into the free code available on the legislature site. Everything from this act on, okay, has not been. And just to give you an example, something I was referring to earlier, this is an example of an act that would never go into a statutory code, right? Establishing a sick leave bank for a particular state employee, right? This is an act of the legislature, but it's not of a general and permanent nature because it's aimed at someone very specific. And presumably the need for this act will go away once the state employee becomes well. Okay, so a lot of these acts would never wind up in a statutory code because they're very specific to a particular person, often to a particular municipality, right? Like this one is just for the housing authority of the city of Melrose. But at any rate, you could go through and update, even if you didn't have Lexis and Westlaw, you could go through and make sure that nothing has happened to the code since June 30th just by scrolling through these session laws. Okay, same thing for New York. New York's is laid out kind of funky, but if you just Google New York session laws, it'll bring you to this page. And what you would want to look at is chapters. Okay, these are all of the acts that were passed by the New York legislature in 2012. I don't think they've passed anything yet in 2013. Okay, so they passed 504 laws, and these are just arranged chronologically. So what I want to go in is just to show you guys, a lot of you have probably looked already at Massachusetts statutes. So I'm going to browse. I went to Massachusetts. Statutes and court rules. All statutory codes have constitutional provisions in the first volumes. So this is a great place to start constitutional research, particularly if you don't have a good secondary source to use and get started with, because it's an annotated version of the Constitution. So you can find references to important case law, to secondary sources if you haven't looked there already. This from here down is all court rules, which we'll talk about later, but this parts 1 through 5, this is the actual, these are statutes. Okay. So a couple things I want to point out. Few entry points here, right? We could browse the table of contents. We could run a search in the main search bar. We could run an advanced search. Okay, this is more like classic terms and connectors with your cheat sheet. If you were getting too many hits, not enough relevant hits, and you knew maybe the caption had a particular term in it, you wanted a term to appear a certain number of times, this is where you can really customize the search. So these are the full text searching options. Notice that you also have an index. This replicates the index that you'd find in the print set. So the example I'm going to do is where I want to find the punishment for stalking. So we can go down, find the entry for stalking in the index, and then look at all the different sub-entries. Okay. All right. Alternatively, backed up one too many screens. I mentioned this earlier. If you know the popular name of an act, somebody tells you they need you to go look up Melanie's Law. You have no idea what Melanie's Law is. Use a popular name table. It's alphabetical by the popular name of the act, and you could be like, oh, okay, it has to do with driving while under the influence. You'll notice that there are several entries. This was a huge act, right? And it was wound up being codified in a few different places in the code. That's why there are several entries. Okay, most of it went into Chapter 90, which is where our drunk driving laws are, but there's also provision in Chapter 265. So you could use the popular name table to get to where Melanie's Law was placed in the code. Okay. So I want to do again, I want to pull up our stalking provision. So I'm just going to run a basic search. And again, the next search engine is so good. It's usually not that hard to pull up the relevant provision. Okay. So we're in the Westlaw version of the Massachusetts Statutory Code, Mass General Laws Annotated, Chapter 265, Section 43. This provision has to do with the crime of stalking and the punishment of stalking. Okay. Notes of decisions. This is where courts have interpreted the provision. This is historical information. You can find a lot of good info here. Citing references. This is like treatises, cases, so on that have cited this statutory provision. Context and analysis. This is references to secondary sources, treatises, cross references to relevant provisions in the United States Code, all sorts of handy stuff. All right. What I want to focus on here is this credit section. This is where the session law information that I was talking about earlier comes in. Get a lot of questions. What's all that stuff under the statute? These are history notes, basically. You can see that this provision was first added in 1992. Okay, so this is a session law citation. This is Chapter 31. Meaning the 31st law passed by the Massachusetts legislature in 1992. So this is great. If you needed to know what this looked like when it was originally passed, you could actually go and look at the session law. Okay. If you needed to look at the official version, you'd go pull the 1992 volume of the Acts and Resolves. Okay. And this is where you can sort of visualize, I think, a little bit better how a session law affects a code. So this is a law passed by the legislature, and they're saying, look, we want to amend the code, the subject matter code, by adding a new provision. Okay, at Chapter 265, Section 43. Okay. And then this provision, okay, added in 1992. It was amended in 1996. So for most jurisdictions in the 90s, you can click through and actually take a look at the session law, right? You could go see what that 1996 Act did, amended again in 97, again and amended again in 2010. Okay, so that's really, really helpful for historical research if you needed to know what this looked like at a given point in time. And again, references to secondary sources, notes of decision, and so on. Okay, and always keep in mind you can arrow through just like you would in a book. This is sort of the equivalent of flipping a page. You can always pull up the table of contents, right? Because it's very important to look at surrounding provisions, make sure there aren't definitions that maybe affect the interpretation of your statute. Okay, so that's a mass statute on Westlaw. Next, just to show you another example in New York. I want to look at the New York statutes. Lexis's publication of the New York Code is called the New York Consolidated Law Service. Again, you could browse the table of contents. This is where I was saying that it's what's called a nominative code, so it's not so much arranged by chapter number, it's different subject matters, which I think actually makes it a little bit easier. So you could, if you were looking for the definition of a particular crime, you could just search the penal law part of the code. You could do a natural language search. Like I said, on Lexis, you can just search the table of contents, or you can do a full search. You can click out and get an advanced screen. This has your cheat sheets. If you want to do a terms and connector search, okay, this is where you can search a particular segment and so on. But we're just going to do a natural language search for stalking. Okay, and I just want to look at stalking in the first degree. You get the text of the statute. Okay. Actually, I want to mention one thing about currentness. This is saying, right, that this provision of the code is current through chapter 1 through 491 of 2012. That's telling you how many session laws have been incorporated, right? So the first 491 laws passed by the New York legislature have been incorporated on Lexis. So any change that occurred because of these laws that affect your provision have already been incorporated. You don't have to worry about them. But 492 through 504, and then potentially anything that has happened in 2013, have not been incorporated yet. Okay, so potentially there could be a problem or something that's happened. Theoretically, though, if you shepherdized it, you get a flag that there's some sort of pending legislation, so you'd want to check this and make sure that it hasn't passed, right? That the pending legislation isn't one of these acts that passed since 491. Okay, let's back up a second and just show you what this looks like on Westlaw. So current through chapter 416 of the mass laws, you'll notice there are a few random ones that haven't been incorporated. Usually these are big budgetary acts that are huge, and it takes the people at West and Lexis a long time to get through. So again, current through chapter 416. And in this case, this is actually even more up to date, right, than the Mass Legislature site. So you're not going to find much more here. Okay. Alright, so I'm just going to flip back over to Lexis, back up a screen. So here we're sort of on alert that there's some pending legislation you might want to look at. Text of the statute. This is the history notes similar to the credits that we were looking at on Westlaw, where you can see that this provision was added, okay, in 1999 by the 635th law, passed by the New York legislature in 1999, and then it's been amended a few times since. Okay, and these hyperlinks allow you to track those changes. Okay, so hopefully that's, I know not a thrilling introduction to statutes, but hopefully helpful, particularly to those of you who haven't done as much statutory research. So we'll really start delving in and looking at statutes in class, both in print and online. So think about if there are any questions you have, and I'm happy to go over these things again. All right, so I'll see you guys on Thursday.